we have 3 people in here who have, all they have to do left is take the test, because they've filled the requirements for all the attendants, 2 and 3, which means if they pass the test to get at least an 80% score, they get $250. And it's really hard to fail because they just give it back to me and I show them which ones they got wrong and they just keep doing it again. So this is given for college-bound teenagers. What we're trying to do is get more kids into the class. So far, so good. Okay, so here we go. Class 18, we're on 18 now. We finished book 1, we're into book 2. Book 2 is about to close. We're looking at the second half of what we're talking about today, which is evolution. Second half of evolution. And we're looking at what they teach you in school. Okay? Really important. I want you to get a feel. We're going directly into the Lee Summit textbooks. We're pulling stuff out of the high school textbooks so that you can look at what they're being taught and get an idea of what's going on. We talked about just a minute ago the difference between being taught how to think and what to think. Okay? So, this is the origin of man. We're closing out book 2. What our kids are taught. Abiogenesis. Vestigial organs, imperfections. Natural selection. Everybody probably knows that term. Transitional forms. Fossil, human fossils. Looking at where I came from then. We looked last week in the first half at what David Berlinski had to say. We put up the 4 criteria on how you would go ahead and test for scientific evidence. Today we're going to talk a little bit more about Jonathan Wells, what he had to say. And the big one you see all the time, this whole idea of chimp DNA and how it clearly shows that we have a similar ancestor as a chimp. How many people have heard that? Right? We come basically from some ancestor and we're linked to monkeys. When Christopher Hitchens was alive, one of the most famous new atheists in debates, he would always have a phrase. He would say, and everybody knows we're 1 chromosome away from a chimpanzee. And nobody ever challenged him. They just kept on with the debate. And I'd sit there going, does anybody say anything? Do they understand this? So we're going to get into that a little bit so you can see what we're being taught in school and what the truth is. Okay, here we go. So there's this class, 17 and 18, teaches these 9 things in depth. And we're pulling them out of the textbooks and we're refuting them with the truth. And when you put them together, it makes a very strong case against Darwinian evolution. Number 1, this whole idea of the Miller-Urey experiment, it's still in textbooks and it's been shown to be false. It's failed, but they still teach it. Common ancestry, the tree of life has been shown to be a made-up story. There's no evidence to show common descent. Haeckel's embryos we talked about last year. Ernst Haeckel staged the photos. He made them up so that it looked like we have common ancestry with animals. It's proven false. It's still in the Lee Summit textbooks as evidence that we come from some primordial ancestor. Homology. We talk about the fact that this thing called a pedactyl structure in your hand is similar to pedactyl structures in bats, in dolphins, and all these different animals. And they use that as evidence for evolution. Now, the fact is, we talked about 2 things. The first one was, so God uses a similar design in different animals. Big deal. He must like the pedactyl structure. He uses it over and over again. The second thing in your book you can read is how they discovered that actually the genome, the genetics, don't back up ancestry by homologous structures. You have unique genes that are used in unique animals to create the pedactyl structure. So it can't be common descent. Fossil record. There's absolutely no evidence in the fossil record, and we have millions of fossils to show any kind of transitional forms. You hear what I'm saying now? This is one of the big things they talk about all the time. Then along comes Cambrian explosion, where within this supposed made-up story of gradual change from a primordial soup, they discover, we're going to talk about this today, wham, fully formed animals in the midst of what's supposed to be gradual change. Vertebrates when you shouldn't have vertebrates yet, all this crazy stuff that absolutely rejects Darwinian evolution and led Stephen Jay Gould to come up with this thing he called punctuated equilibrium. I don't know if you ever heard this term. This is typical evolutionary thought, and it's made its way in the textbooks. Well, maybe evolution didn't take millions of years. Maybe it happened instantaneously sometimes. So it takes millions of years, they find a fossil record, refutes it, and they say, oh, yeah, but maybe sometimes it happens immediately. See, so you change your story to fit the evidence instead of the evidence being the truth. Right. Archaeopteryx, one of the most famous ones to say, hey, bird the dinosaur. Well, it's been shown to be a feathered dinosaur. It can't be a transitional form. Galapagos finches. I have a Newsweek cover of an article where the cover of Newsweek for that week was all about this to show that we came from a common ancestor, which has been shown to be false, but still taught. And then, this famous picture. This picture's made up. There's no evidence at all. You guys realize that. There's nothing behind this. Okay. So here we go. So what we're going to look at first is I'm going to take you through the Lee Summit textbook. This is Advanced Biology. This is Concepts and Connections, 5th edition. This is Biology 2 class at Lee Summit High. To understand the story of human evolution, we must understand both our ancestry and our relationship to our closest living kin. Humans are members of the ancient mammalian order primates. Many of our behaviors and characteristics are similar to those of other primates. Some are uniquely human. Anthropoid primates, marmosets, monkeys, apes, and humans. Prosimian primates, lemurs, lorises, and tarsiers. Okay? You didn't know this, of course. I'm just trying to enlighten you, okay? This is why we people in church never get out and understand real science. Of the anthropoid species, the chimpanzees may be the most closely related to humans. Comparisons of chimpanzee and human DNA have shown a high degree of similarity. The similarity suggests that humans and chimps may have shared an ancestor less than 6 million years ago. These are our kids. It's important to understand, however, that humans are not descended from chimpanzees or from any other modern ape. Rather, modern apes and humans are probably, I highlighted and put in italics the words they put in there to try to get away with it. Probably, may have, suggests. See, they throw in these little words to cover themselves. Descended from a more primitive ape-like ancestor. Okay, so tell me, what message is being communicated to our kids in school? What are you being taught here? Yeah. Basically, that God is not your creator. Is that not what's being taught here? Okay. So what you have here is, it's a fact. They throw the little words in there, but what do teenagers and kids walk away with? You good so far? Okay, so let's look at the truth. So again, I'm taking this out of the National Science Museum, Genome Research Institute. This is what they put out there. 98% chimpanzee DNA matches human. Mouse is about 92, and so forth. So this is what they put out there. Okay? So let's zero in here for a minute. So the interesting thing is nobody's listening to this guy. They should. Jeffrey Tompkins, a PhD in genetics at Clemson University, has put out a great YouTube, and he keeps trying to tell people this, but they're not changing their textbooks. He says, the well-known chimpanzee genome paper published in 2005 actually provides a genetic similarity of only about 80% when the duplicated non-similar data are included. I'll explain this in a minute. And only 70% when the estimated size of the genome is incorporated. So what's happening is when they published this in 2005, they found dissimilarities between them, Anything that was dissimilar, they took out and removed. Anything that could help back it up, they added to. All right, so let's watch the video so you can get a better handle on what's going on. It's sad we're not teaching it in church. Right? We think we can't do anything about what's going on in our schools. We can, but we think that way, so we don't. We can do something about what goes on in our church. You think that video would stun young people? Especially if they're taught this nonsense, they'd say, whoa, that video just described why you're special. It just told a 13, 15, 17-year-old struggling with who they are that they're special. Didn't it? And it's not they're special because we figured out something in science. It's because God says so. It's because Christ died for that teenager. And the evidence is overwhelming for it. We're not 98% like a chimp. That's insane. So we're just not teaching it. You guys?
Quick question. How can we get that video? Or what's the title of it?
I'm sorry, I keep that. We can't let anybody have it. No, I'm just teasing with you. Any of these videos, all you got to do is go to your browser on Google and type the name, right? So see the name in the bottom left?
Yes.
That's it.
Okay.
That's one. The second one is Jeffrey Tompkins. That's a different video. That's a literal taping of his genetics class at Clemson, where he's in the classroom and he's going through DNA similarities with chimps during one of his course lectures. Why aren't we being taught this? It's insane, right? Okay, so that's DNA. So far, so good? It's actually very exciting. You know, we shouldn't get too depressed. You know what would be depressing? If we found Jesus' bones. That would be depressing, right? Right? Somebody wheelbarrowed out a load of bones and they could prove it was Jesus Christ. That's depressing. This isn't depressing. This just validates what we already know. We knew this. What it is it should give us a little conviction. You know, the Holy Spirit's, to me, he's amazing. Do you realize he never condemns anyone? Never? I don't know if you ever thought about that. Study through the Bible. You'll never find the Holy Spirit condemning anyone. So what does the Holy Spirit do? Exactly right. The Holy Spirit's job is to lead you to be more like his son for a Christian. And when Jesus said that he was going back to be at the right hand of the Father, he said, but I will send you the Paraclete, right, in Greek? And what does that mean? The helper, who's going to bring all things to your remembrance. He's going to help you. And what he does is he convicts you. And he convicts non-believers. We get all uptight about witnessing and what do I need to say? And the Lord's saying, just relax. Okay, I got it. I got this. Just do me a favor. Get out of my way. You know? And I'll take care of this because I know this person you're talking to. I love them. I created them to be with me. They're not paying attention. I want to use you to get their attention, and I'll take it from here. All we need to do is have a really good understanding of the gospel. And then in America, because of our culture, be able to deconstruct what people think. Now, this is not an argument you have to worry about in Yemen or in Afghanistan, right? We don't need to worry about this. This is not a topic over there. This is our culture. So what you have to do with the gospel is you have to have it fit the culture. You don't change it. The gospel doesn't change. How you apply it changes. So when you look at textbooks with this nonsense in there, you just say, you don't really believe that, do you?
Well, it's sad that this is also a similar culture to a similar issue in China.
Yeah.
It says a lot about of us.
And in book 1, when we were going through where evolution began, we were going through the origin with Stalin. We were going through how Hitler used it. We were going through genetics and eugenics with German doctors. We were explaining how it made its way into the culture. and it had to do with power and domination. Okay, so that's DNA. Okay, your vertebrate eye. Here's an example of what they teach in the Lee Summit High textbooks to show again how you came from a common ancestor. Evidence today supports the hypothesis, again I'm putting in italics the words that I find interesting, that all complex eyes evolved from a simple ancestral patch of photoreceptor cells through a series of incremental modifications that benefit the owners at each stage. The figure below illustrates the range of complexity in the structure of eyes among mollusks living today. This is very similar to what you just heard on DNA, that a very efficient programmer, they'll never start from scratch all over again. I would know this because this is what I do. A lot of my work is with programmers and computer software folks. If they have to write software for a client and they have 80% of it in a template that they can use, they're not going to start from scratch because that's wasted labor. Well, what evolution is based on are bones. Just think about this. There's no evidence for evolution except bones in the ground. So they look at anatomy and physiology. So here they're saying it's structure. So here's what they do. Let me show you the stages of complexity in eyes. Stage 1. Some mollusks have very simple eyes. Okay? These guys have photoreceptor layer of pigment cells, right? That's a pigment cup in a basic mollusk. But you know, some have eyes that have no lenses or other means of focusing. So now they have a cup with a cavity, right, that appears to focus in any kind of light they can. But, you know, you start getting up into octopuses or octopi, whatever you call them, snails. Now all of a sudden, you've got what look like complex eyes. You have a lens and a cornea. So obviously what's going on is, over millions of years and gradual changes, you can see the eye and the structure has evolved over time. Right? Doesn't this look like a possibility? I mean, we can't just say no. I mean, you put together this stuff, okay, this looks like a possibility, right? Now I could take Chevy Corvettes from like the early 60s, and I could line up year after year to the 2019 model. Would you see changes? Right. Did they evolve? Really? Right? So we have a designer who used a common platform and engineers based on customer requirements and efficiency improvements who came up with a new model. But each one is a unique model.
No, they popped out that way.
They popped out that way. So this alone doesn't tell you anything. This tells you, okay, I see a pattern, what's the point? The story is millions of years of incremental changes. That's the story they fit in. So the question is, do you think Darwin himself was as sure as what our high school textbooks seem to be sure about, that eyes came from incremental modifications? Do you think he felt that way? Here's what he said. The eye to this day gives me a cold shudder. To suppose that the eye, with its inimitable contrivances for adjusting the focus at different distances, for emitting different amounts of light, for the correction of spherical and chromatic aberration, could have been formed by natural selection, seems, I freely admit, absurd in the highest possible degree. This is him speaking. Because what he's saying, this is in Origin of Species. What he's saying is, hey guys, if you go by structure alone, fine, but you know what? I've looked at the muscles and how the eye moves. We went over this earlier in book 2. I look at chromatic aberrations in the eye and how it can detect light in different locations and places. And he goes, this makes no sense to me that small changes could have done this. So far, so good? But then, what did we do? We had almost a whole class on biochemistry, which he knew nothing about. And if you remember in biochemistry, we talked about the equation from 11-CTS retinol all the way through the ion channel, sodium ion channel, and how those 16 to 18 protons have to function together. We started out by saying 11-CTS retinol as a protein is linked to rhodopsin. And what happens? It's just floating around in your retina, in the cells, and the minute a photon of light hits 11-CTS retinol, something weird starts happening. And it's happening right now as we look at each other. We can tell the difference between a black shirt and a green shirt only because 11-CTS retinol has been hit with a photon of light. If you turn all the lights off, everybody's wearing black. I don't know if you knew that. The only reason there's color is because of light. And it's a pigment that your proteins in your eyes pick up. Is that not crazy? If I take an orange and I turn the light out, it's actually black. It's a pigment that's got a chromatic color to it designed by God that your eye picks up when light comes on and 11-CTS retinol is activated. So light hits 11-CTS retinol, boom. Now, you had to be in class when we went through this because I don't want to have to go through it again, but basically what happens is photons cause proteins to link and delink with one another in a cataclysmic equation based on what the previous protein did, otherwise it doesn't do it, to end up with an electrical signal sent to your brain. So you don't see with your eyes, you see with your brain. That is impossible with small incremental changes. But Darwin knew nothing about biochemistry. We don't teach this in school either, and we should be. I love what God says because he's kind of annoying.
Does that mean that men that are colorblind have brain damage?
It's not brain damage. It's going to be in your eyes and your retina, right? The brain's operating fine. It's just taking a signal, a photon signal from your eye to your brain. So your brain's not damaged. It's the interpretation of the data, right? That's all it is. So I always ask these questions throughout here. Is there any wisdom literature that says where the human eye came from? This is the annoying thing about God. Tell me who planted the ear, who formed the eye. So God's just saying, I'm not going to go through the protein sequence and how it works in Genesis chapter 18, okay? I was thinking about it, but I didn't put it in there. I just need you to trust me on this because when you look at it, you'll know there's a designer. He does this all the time. He's so annoying. If he would just explain the Hubble law, if he had a chapter that explained why gravity works the way it does, don't you think most of us would believe in God? If we had a book that's over 2,000 years old that explained gravity before it was discovered, how do you think people would react? What do you think they'd do?
An interpolation.
Why? Why do you say that?
A modern scientist put it in there.
Right, so they still wouldn't believe, right? Okay, so you have, there's excellent. It doesn't matter what's in there. That's why God says it requires you trust him. You have Lazarus and the rich man. And you have that, I think it's Luke 16, right? So you have the story of what happens. You have the rich man in hell. And he's looking at Abraham. And Lazarus is with Abraham. And he basically, as you go through the story, he says, I have brothers and I don't want them coming to this place of torment. So if you could, send Lazarus back from the dead. And when they see Lazarus back from the dead, they'll believe. Do you remember that? How does Abraham answer him? It won't work. Even if they see someone rise from the dead, they still won't believe. But Abraham says something interesting. He goes, they have something better than people rising from the dead. What do they have?
Prophets.
They have Moses and the prophets. What did he just say? They have the Old Testament. That's what he's saying. They've got the Old Testament. That's all they need to see that I'm real. Did you ever think of that before? People don't even need the New Testament. Remember what we went through earlier in class in book 2. Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. Day after day utters speech, and night after night reveals knowledge. People can just look around and they know there's a God. Right? Jesus is saying they don't need anybody rising from the dead. So, again, hear with eyes. Somebody says something silly like, well, there's bones in the ground, and if we put them together, we see the eye changing in its socket. And Darwin was smart enough to say, I don't know, I found some things that are so crazy, I don't think they could happen the way I'm saying they happen. Fossil record. There's a picture in one of the class textbooks showing a fish, and as it begins to get legs and starts walking. Okay? Here's Darwin on transitional forms. Since innumerable transitional forms must have existed, why do we not find them embedded in countless numbers in the crust of the earth? In other words, nobody's finding any. Why is it not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology does not reveal any such finely gradated organic chain. He knew that. And this perhaps is the most obvious and gravest objection against my theory. Why isn't that in the textbooks? This is him speaking.
It's almost like they wouldn't listen to him once after he made his initial play.
Right.
And then we're like, well, no, that would make me wrong. So I'm not,
Right. And what does it tell you about people? Look at what's going on in our country right now. I keep bringing up these examples to you guys. Does it make any sense that a 30-year-old man should be able to go in the same bathroom as a 10-year-old girl? Does that make any logical sense at all? So obviously, what people want isn't based on logic. It's not based on what people know makes sense. And we have example after example. I'm showing you stuff here that if it were taught in the schools, people would logically conclude evolution can't be true based on evidence. Instead, we have these silly internet arguments over evolution's a fact, and it's like, it's a waste of time to even talk because nobody is taking this stuff into account. Here's Colin Patterson, for years and years and years, the leading expert on fossil history at the British Museum of Natural History. If I knew of any transitions, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. In other words, none exist in the British Museum of Natural History. I will lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil for which one could make a watertight argument. It's easy enough to make up stories of how one form gave rise to another and to find reasons why the stages should be favored by natural selection, but such stories are not part of science. For there is no way of putting them to the test. In other words, it's philosophy. So what I've asked teachers about is, what if we had a class on the philosophy of the origin and diversity of life, where you could take evolution and creation and you could just talk through the two? Because it's philosophy. The reason it's not happening is no one will admit that evolution is not factual. They're holding to that. So to arm our kids to make sure they understood is absolutely essential, because when they leave the church, if they don't understand this, professors with PhDs are going to be more powerful than Phil Hopper. Don't you agree? I've had pastors in this church tell me, when their kids got to college and called me, I had kids calling me on their, or texting me on their cell phone, I'm in class, here's what they're saying, Ed, should I say something? What should I say? I've had this happen. And so one of them, and I'm telling them what to say, I say, raise your hand, ask it this, we're going back and forth and everything. And then maybe it was a couple weeks later, the pastor pulled me aside, we had a conversation, and he told me, he said, I don't really want to go that far because I can't afford for my kid to drop out of school or get an F, so I can't afford it. So we talk about this stuff, but we don't take it seriously. We're not willing to stand up. Here's the most famous evolutionist of history. He's an atheist. He died recently. He was the professor of zoology really at Harvard. And he's honest. The fossil record with its abrupt transitions offers no support for gradual change. All paleontologists know that the fossil record contains precious little in the way of intermediate forms. The extreme variety of transitional forms in the fossil record persist as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence. So this branching tree, what he's saying is, yeah, we feel okay at the absolute tips. In other words, what he's saying is, yeah, they're a unique species. Or at the very bottom, but in between, we don't have a clue. There's no evidence for it. We made it up. These are the leaders. These are the experts. Then it gets worse. Okay? Then it gets worse. It gets worse for them. It gets better for if you're a Christian. Much better. So, when we talk about this thing called the Cambrian explosion, okay, so I'm giving you the first little piece here of what they put in textbooks. Earliest life, raw chemicals are said to have spontaneously formed organic molecules in the early oceans that combined to form a simple living organism. Now, the refutation of that is on the right. Complicated lab experiments made some amino acids, but nothing approaching a protein. In other words, that's not true. Okay, then this happens. In the 1980s, 3 excavations happened. One was in Canada, another in Greenland, another in China. And what they discovered was this. What they discovered is something abrupt in the geological strata. Right in the formation, which is what Darwin explained and everybody believed, is you have layer upon layer, successive changes over time. So you're going to see as you dig in these different layers, you're going to see this evolutionary modification and find fossils with transitional forms. Well, right after they looked at algae and bacteria, all of a sudden they found vertebrates, backbones with complex organs, before they found any kind of single life form like a trilobite or a jellyfish. They found a fully functional vertebrate animal. Then what happened, and here's what he said in that box: every known phylum suddenly appeared in the early part of the period. So all of a sudden you started getting these phylums appearing, and then all of a sudden you're not finding anything which they described in evolution of an invertebrate to a vertebrate. That's a huge evolutionary change, where you have invertebrate structures like a mollusk, and then you end up with a spinal section with a bone structure that supports the organs, before you ever go from a fish to a mammal, to an amphibian, to a reptile, to a mammal. Well, boom, vertebrates show up. So what they came back and they showed this clearly in multiple studies with leading scientists, that you would find fully formed organisms that abruptly appear at the same time as the simplest life forms, which is impossible by evolution. For example, they named this thing Opabinia. It was about 3 feet long, had 5 eyes, long claw arm, full skeleton. At the same time as you're seeing jellyfish and early amoebas. You have this thing called Anomalocaris. It was a predator that would feed on other organisms. Where did this come from? This is not the way evolution would describe it. So far, so good? They don't teach this in the classroom either. The argument back on this from evolutionists was led by Stephen Jay Gould. This is when he jumped in with what he called, what was the word I used a minute ago? It's kind of a silly phrase. I'll think of it in a minute. But let's watch a video here where Jonathan Wells talks about this a little bit.
Interesting.
There's a lot of this type of knowledge that's known, and it's not taught, right? You have to go find it. So this talk that he's given, Jonathan Wells, is about the overwhelming evidence for evolution. Really? So he's gone through these to help people. So again, how do we educate our teenagers and our young people? How do we do it? It's not going to happen on Sunday morning, right? How do we, and that's why I say when I started this class, we were in here a little earlier, how do I get more mothers and fathers in here too, right? So you can see, hey, I can go to, and this stuff is all free. I can go to lesson 78 on Ed's website and sit with my child and just show them the truth behind DNA, you know? So arming them so that they're more effective in sharing the gospel by deconstructing the nonsense out there their friends believe so they can get back to the truth. Does this make sense? Okay, so this is the Cambrian explosion. Now, here's your bird. This is like, when you look at it, it does make you pause for a minute. So when we look at Archaeopteryx, this is a cast of the fossil that you'll find in the Humboldt University Museum in Berlin. You can see it has a long bony tail like a reptile, toothed jaw, not a beak, similar to reptiles, feathers similar to birds, claws on the wings, right? Aha, we found it. We found the evolutionary link between birds and reptiles, was the claim. So once again, evolution is based on physiology, structures, and morphology, bones. It's based on that. It's not based on development or anything else we know. It's just on what you see. So this is the rendering out of the high school textbook. Okay? Harvard University professor Ernst Mayr back in the late 1800s said, it is the almost perfect link between reptiles and birds. You'll see this today on infidel atheist websites. You'll have it on social media arguments. You'll rarely have any professor stand up and say this is true anymore. But it persists in our textbooks. The problem we're having here is nobody's reading science. So here in 2009, from the American Museum of Natural History, and you can find this with many evolutionists even today, they're going to say this. Bird features like feathers and wishbones have been found in many non-avian dinosaurs. In other words, birds that didn't fly. Microscopic imaging of bone structure shows that these famously feathered fossils grew much slower than living birds and more like non-avian dinosaurs. In other words, as birds, using what they call cladistics, as they looked at sequences of birds from prehistoric times on fossils, they see that they would discover in different time layers in geology, like Cambrian, Jurassic, and others, they would find feathered dinosaurs that had a structure for their wings that was hollowed out, different than like non-flying ones. They would find those much earlier than this one. And yet what they were claiming here is this was the ancestor, and then you've got flying dinosaurs later. The fossil record flips it around. So it says that now we know the transition into true birds physiologically and metabolically happened after Archaeopteryx. So this isn't the missing link. Evolutionists say it's not. Now, of course, people like us, we look at it and say, of course, we knew that all along because it has feathers, but big deal doesn't make it, it's like a duck-billed platypus. Just because it looks that weird and everything doesn't mean it was a link. So, Henry G., and chief science writer for Nature, in 1999 put it this way. Again, this is back in 1999 even. Once Archaeopteryx stood alone as the earliest fossil bird, its uniqueness made it an icon, conferring the status of an ancestor. But the existence of other bird ancestors shows that Archaeopteryx is just another dinosaur with feathers. It's not a bird. So you'll still find it in textbooks as a bird, right, that came from a reptile. The fossil record for human beings. You'll find several of these still in your textbook. You'll actually see them if you were to go home and go to the internet and look for human missing links or human fossil record, you'll find most of these. So let's just walk through these kind of quickly. You'll also find these in your book. Lucy. All experts agree Lucy was a 3-foot-tall chimp. Heidelberg man. Now, this is a riot. This fossil was built from just a jawbone that when they conceded later there was a hoax, it was probably the jawbone of a man. It wasn't any primitive form. So in other words, they came up with a whole missing link from a jawbone. That's all they had. Nebraska man, built up from one tooth. They found a tooth, and they came up with a missing link as a human. You'll find this kind of stuff in a textbook.
Extrapolate from to this.
Because what happens is they'll find a tooth, and then 10 miles away, they'll find a bone, and they'll start saying, well, you know, things just spread out. But they start with the tooth because the tooth didn't resemble anything they've seen before. And they create a fossil record of a man.
From a tooth.
From a tooth. Piltdown man. You'll find this in your textbook. I walk through the sequence year over year of how they discovered this to be a hoax. It was built up from a jawbone again, and the jawbone was found to be just an ape. Peking man. Supposedly 500,000 years old, but there's no evidence for it, so they made that up. Neanderthal man. I walk through Neanderthals in the book, so you can follow the whole progression there. Basically, it showed that it was a human being suffering from arthritis, lived in France. It was a man. New Guinea man, dates back to 1970, found in the region outside of Australia, was a human skull, was a human structure, not a missing link. Cro-Magnon man, one of the earliest and best established fossils, equal in physical and brain capacity to man. So what's the difference? Right? We have a whole series of Geico commercials, I think, showing this, right? And what is they telling you in the commercial? That he's a missing link. Is basically what they're telling you. And everybody just follows along with it. Modern man. This genus thinks we came from a monkey. Right? So I love that. Right? This is exactly what Paul's saying. We think we're wise and we're foolish. So, there is no fossil record. There's nothing. And yet, people will talk incessantly about the fossil record. So I always ask people, show me. I'm really interested. If you go on my website, there's a debate we had in this room with a humanist society, an atheist group, a guy who's a purported expert on fossils, and me and Kevin Hubbard, right? And this place was packed out, and you can watch it. And the first guy to present was this expert on fossils, and he went through just what you saw here. Look at the radial curvature of the knee bone, and you can see over time how this could have went from a monkey to a he just went through fossil structures. And then I got up there and I said, you know, who believes that stuff? Because that doesn't prove anything. And I started talking about blood coagulation and the eye and the giraffe, and I threw another one in there that we looked at. We looked at kinesin. Do you remember kinesin? The little transport mechanism that moves organelles around the cell. So I'm going through this stuff, and I said, guys, he's telling a story. I'm using evidence. Right? Okay, natural selection is the crowning jewel for Darwinism. He leveraged George Lyell to come up with his theory of common descent, with this being the basis for it. And here's what natural selection says. Okay, reproductive ability, geometric increase, but environmental restrictions. So animals are reproducing, but there's not a lot of resources available, is the first issue. The second one, so if all the offspring that organism can produce were to survive and reproduce, they'd soon overrun the earth, is the point. So you have competition now over limited resources. So there's a struggle to survive, and the ones who do pass on their traits. So parents possessing certain genetic traits that enable them to survive and reproduce will contribute this information to the next generation's offspring. So the ones that make it are then getting the best genes, and the ones that aren't very good die off. Which means they've been selected by nature, and there's a persistence over millions of years of this adaptive genetic information by a luck of the draw and chance as they survive, plus changes in the environment that make it possible. The population in the next generation will have more individuals that possess the new genetic information that will enable their parents to then survive and reproduce. So it's an ongoing cycle. This is the story behind natural selection and how it works. It's never been demonstrated even once to happen. You would think, after watching the Kentucky Derby yesterday, that we would have five-legged horses or horses with wings or something that would be them able to compete and keep surviving and winning, right? But as Jonathan Wells just talked about, every genetic structure of every organism, every species has a limitation on how far it can go, which is why you only get a fruit fly, a defective fruit fly, or a dead fruit fly. You can't get anything else. It's the same with any organism. So what is evolution? Change in traits from new information leading to a new kind. This isn't microevolution we talked about before. This isn't just evolving into a better baseball player. This is going from a lower life form and ending up as a human being. This is what's taught in our schools.
Are they still doing the Olduvai Gorge and Mary and Lewis Leakey?
The Leakey stuff from Africa?
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's Lucy, too, with one of her grandchildren later in Discoveries, but absolutely. So here's the definition by Darwin. I call this principle by which each slight variation is useful is preserved by the term natural selection. So the useful changes, as I described in these 4 steps, are how you end up with nature selecting a more complex life form, like a teenage girl, right? Or like, this different level animal. Now, do you know what the original name was for Origin of the Species? That wasn't the name he had first come up with for his book. And this name is what attracted Hitler and Stalin. This was the original name. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting? He wasn't, Darwin himself wasn't pointing like racism. He wasn't going there, but everybody grabbed onto it as an idea. That was the name of the book. And here's what Nazi General Friedrich von Bernhardt said. From an evolutionary standpoint, it's biologically right to crush the weaker peoples of the earth. War is not a biological law, but a moral obligation. This is leveraging Darwinism for a supreme Aryan race, and why Hitler couldn't stand Jesse Owens. Right? Some black guy comes in the Olympics and beats the tar of all his Aryan supreme athletes. Right? And it's really neat if you ever go back and watch the video, though. The guy he ended up going for the gold medal, the champion from Germany, the white guy, he and Jesse Owens were friends. And he actually compliments Jesse for how incredible he is. Well, imagine what happened to him later, right? We no longer heard of him again after the Olympics. But this is what, again, kids don't understand the implication of what they're being taught. You following me? So let's look at now the evidence in the textbooks and the evidence you can find anywhere on the website. Galapagos finches. You got all these finches, all these different types of finches, right? Very famous study. Darwin's theory was that a single species will diverge into several varieties, then different species through natural selection. A species means a literal different life form, right? In 1835, Darwin collected specimens of 13 different finches scattered among 12 islands in the Galapagos. A little side note, I put this here, but the truth is he didn't collect anything. Someone did it for him. So he wasn't really going around collecting finches when he was there, but I put it there just to make it simple. The finding, these finches differ in size and shape of their beaks. That was a big finding. And we're talking millimeters, just little changes. The reason is because they're adapted to the foods they're eating. So in the book, I go through this in depth, like 2 pages, to explain the effect of El Nino and how the effect of El Nino changes the seed sizes so that it caused the beaks of these birds to change if they were going to survive. And it would select out those birds whose beaks were too small and couldn't eat the bigger seeds during an El Nino event. The theory is the 13 species evolved from a common ancestor versus natural selection. Now, first thing you notice, a finch is a finch. So we're not getting anything different. We're getting changes among finches. But there is selection going on here. But it's not the selection as defined by Darwin. What it is, scientifically, by measuring the beaks and seeing the changes, they call it oscillating selection, because what happens, literally, is the beak sizes change depending on the weather conditions. So the birds with the smaller beaks that couldn't handle the bigger seeds were dying off, and the ones that could compete, that had bigger beaks that could crush the bigger seeds, would live. And when it flipped, some of those with smaller beaks that did manage to survive were able to repopulate, and they would be there. But you would never see anything different than that. You would just see the change in a beak size. And the change isn't like, a little tiny nose and my schnoz, like 2 big changes. It was like, we're talking, I can't even show millimeters with my hand, right? These small little changes. So the point was this. Philip Johnson put this in the Wall Street Journal. When our leading scientists have to resort to the sort of distortion that would land a stock promoter in jail, they're in trouble. This is their best evidence for natural selection. For going from a fish to a human being, or transitioning from a fish to a mammal. There's so much we can't go over in this class. We don't have time for everything, but another one I love to use is when you look at a fish's heart. A fish has 2 chambers, right? How many chambers does a human heart have? 4. When you move to a mammal or a reptile, there's 3. All right, so how on earth do you go from 2 to 3 to 4? How does that happen? I mean, you can go on and on with these examples. There's no evidence for this stuff. This is what's in your child's textbook. So, can you have this with the Bible? Can you have, my opinion, I'll just say this, I don't think evolution could ever be drawn to connect with the Bible, biblical truth. A lot of people think it can. Theistic evolution, God could have used it. You'll hear this in debates from even scholars. So I just want to show you the examples, and you tell me what you think. What evolution teaches? Evolution says that nature selects the fittest individuals in a population as they struggle for survival in their environment. That's what it says. So far, so good? As the most fit survive and produce offspring, the weakest die off and the strongest prosper. right?
Well, that is.
Okay. Now, look at what the Bible says. The Bible is so against survival of the fittest. I don't know how anyone can draw this connection. If we look at 2 Corinthians, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in your weakness. Therefore, most gladly, I'd rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in needs, in persecution and distress for Christ's sake, because when I'm weak, I'm strong. So far, so good? Look at this one. This is taken out of Acts. I have shown you in every way by laboring that you must support the weak. And remember the words of the Lord Jesus Christ, it's blessed to give than receive. That is exactly opposite, right? I've given this example before. If an elderly woman gets on the bus, the worst thing I could do by Darwinian evolution is just give her my seat. Because I want her to die off, right? So why do I give her my seat? Right? Why do I? Because probably I'm a nice guy. I mean, people, and what is niceness? What is this idea of personality, of being caring? What is that? It's immaterial. I can't measure that, right? Animals would not do that. That's because I have a soul, I have a spirit. I am not who I look to be right now. I'm a spirit being that God's created, that He put me in this earth suit, right? So here you have clearly God saying, whoever's weak, take care of him, because I'm going to judge you one day on how well you cared for the least. Kind of gets worse though, right? That's coming from the mouth of Jesus Christ. You know how you're blessed? Not if you compete and are able to outdo everyone. Not if you're able to advance up the ladder at work, or score the most touchdowns, or perform better, all these things. Actually, how merciful are you to others? There's absolutely in my mind no connection to evolution with biblical truth. So this is what's going on, guys. In our schools, it's to remove the Bible. If you just say that, everybody goes, you're one of those right-wing, crazy Christian people that think everybody's out to get you.
Yes.
Just walk through and look at it. What's going on? We're humanistic now. We're secular. The Bible's a myth. It's not that important, right? So where are we going to get the generations coming to understand this stuff, to have knowledge? Should be in the churches. And we should be taking the schools to task if they're telling lies. This makes sense? It's hard to get people motivated, though, to get people excited, because we're all busy, but this is what's happening. Guys okay? Okay. So that's today. We just finished book 2. Book 1 was worldviews, how people think. Book 2 was science. It's amazing. We had 10 lessons on science. Who would have thought you could connect the Bible with science? Now we move into book 3. We're going to start book 3 next week. Book 3 is the Bible reliable? How do you know the Bible is true? The person of Jesus Christ. How do you know He even existed? How do you know He's really God? How do you know He's the only way to heaven? So we're going to go in depth, and we're looking at evidence. We're tying the Bible to it so you can see clearly we're on very good ground here by living our lives to give the control of our life to Him, because everything points to that.